Welcome students back to chapter 4. This lecture will focus on the first of our 4 major tissue types, that being epithelial tissues. So epithelium is our boundary tissues, our lining tissues typically, stuff that covers us. We also have epithelial tissue that is what we call glandular tissue. So it's kind of the secretory tissue in things like our sweat glands, the salivary glands, so on and so forth. So typically epithelial tissues will be kind of found in one of those two places, either covering, lining the external and internal surfaces, and then making up the glands of our body that do all of the kind of secretions that our body does, and our body does quite a lot of secretions. So there are some characteristics that all of the epithelial tissues share, even though in terms of their structure and function they can look quite different. The first of which is what we call polarity, apical basal polarity. So the apical surface is kind of the free surface, whereas the basal surface of the epithelial tissue is kind of the attached surface, the bottom part of the epithelial tissue, basal, right, bottom. So it's next to those underlying connective tissues. So this is our epithelial tissue just right here. So here is the apical surface, and then here is the basal surface. This here is not then epithelial tissue. The other characteristic that epithelial tissues share is that they have lots and lots of those tight junctions and desmosomes. Now, how many they have, kind of the variety, the quantity of the desmosomes and the quantity of the tight junctions kind of depends on which epithelial tissue we happen to be talking about, but we will find these specialized contacts very often in our epithelial tissues. Epithelial tissues are also always supported by kind of underlying connective tissues, and there's really a primary reason for that. And that is because epithelial tissues are avascular. So A means without. So they are without blood vessels. So these epithelial tissues here, since they don't have any blood vessels, they have to get their oxygen and nutrients from the blood vessels that are in the underlying connective tissue. And that's why epithelial tissues are always supported by connective tissues. The other kind of key characteristic with epithelial tissues is that they have a very high regenerative capacity. Epithelial tissues go through mitosis like gangbusters. They have a huge ability to just replicate themselves pretty much constantly. So those are kind of the 5 characteristics of epithelial tissues. Avascular but innervated, high regeneration, specialized contacts, supportive connective tissues, and that apical basal polarity. The lining epithelia, kind of the boundary surface tissues, are classified in 2 ways. We look at the number of layers of cells and the shape of the cells themselves. And the great thing about the epithelial tissues is that they tell you in their name what they look like. So we have simple tissues that have a single layer and stratified tissues that have multiple layers. So our 3 shapes are squamous, cuboidal, and columnar. Squamous cells are flat and scale-like. Cuboidal cells are boxy, right? They're like cubes, hence cuboidal. And columnar cells are tall rectangles. In the squamous cells, the nuclei tend to get flattened out because the whole cell is pretty flat. In the cuboidal cells, the nuclei will be pretty round, and then in the columnar cells, the nucleus tends to get a little elongated. So if I were to tell you that we were looking at a simple squamous tissue, that would tell you that that particular tissue has a single layer of cells, and those cells happen to be these flat scale-like cells. And almost all of the epithelial tissues are like that. A stratified cuboidal tissue, multiple layers, boxy cells. so on and so forth. So that's kind of one of the neat things about epithelial tissues. Just by looking at the name of the epithelial tissue, you can kind of figure out what kind of tissue it is. So let's look at our kind of primary epithelial tissues. Alright, so this is simple squamous. This is stratified squamous. Single layer, flat cells, multiple layers, flat cells. The simple squamous tissue makes very slick, smooth surfaces, so we tend to find it lining, say, our blood vessels, so we have a nice smooth flow for our blood. We also tend to find it where filtration takes place, like this image here, which is from the lungs. So since it's a single layer of flat cells, things can move really very easily kind of from one compartment to the next because there isn't a whole lot separating them. We tend to find this around what we call our glomerulus in our kidney as well, where we filter our blood in the process of making urine. Stratified squamous cells are more protective in nature, right? There's multiple layers, so since there's a lot of layers, there's a lot of protection against abrasion. And so stratified squamous cells tend to be more things like our skin. If we look at our cuboidal cells, we can have simple cuboidal cells, tissues, or stratified cuboidal tissues. Now, typically, the stratified cuboidal tissue only has 2 layers, whereas the stratified squamous can have like 30 or 40. Typically, the stratified cuboidal just has 2. So the cuboidal tissues are kind of secretory, kind of absorptive in nature. So you'll find simple cuboidal tissues in the tubules of our kidneys, where we reabsorb and secrete stuff into our urine. It will be the lining of the ducts in order to get stuff from a gland out, say a sweat gland, out onto the surface of the skin. That's what some of these stratified cuboidal tissues are found in a duct, particularly like a larger duct. This is simple columnar tissue. The nuclei tend to be kind of in a row, single layer. This is the tissue of our digestive tract. So it's, again, a very much absorptive and secretory tissue, like this little goblet cell here. Stratified columnar, like stratified cuboidal, tends to only have 2 layers of cells. It's pretty rare, just like stratified cuboidal is pretty rare. Some of our mammary glands and the ducts leading out of our mammary glands have stratified columnar epithelial tissues. And then the last 2 are kind of funky, right? So this one here is what we call pseudostratified columnar epithelia. It is typically ciliated right here, so there's little hair-like cilia, but this is a tissue that is what we call falsely or fake stratified. That's what pseudo means. It means kind of fake. So even though this tissue looks like it's a stratified tissue with multiple layers, it is actually still a single layer of cells. All of the columnar cells here, whether it's this one here or this one here, they're all in connection to that underlying connective tissue. So even though it looks like multiple layers, it isn't. It's still just a single layer of cells, and hence pseudostratified, fake stratified. Pseudostratified epithelial tissue is the tissue of our respiratory tract, so things like our kind of nasal passages and the trachea, our airways. It's also the epithelial tissue that lines the oviducts that bring the egg into the uterus during the process of reproduction in females. This last epithelial tissue is kind of the only one that doesn't tell you in its name what it looks like, and it's called transitional epithelium. This is the epithelial tissue that lines our urinary tract, and the transitional name actually refers to the fact that depending on whether, say, the bladder is empty or full, the epithelial tissue transitions from one form to another. When the bladder is empty, these soft, what we call umbrella cells, they look like big squishy marshmallows to me, are kind of big and bulbous and soft and squishy. But then when the bladder is full, the umbrella cells kind of compact down, allowing the bladder to expand a little bit in order for the bladder to hold a little bit more urine. So it transitions from kind of looking somewhat stratified cuboidal to looking more, say, stratified squamous if the bladder happened to be full. So since it transitions from one form to another, that is why it is called transitional epithelium. So we have simple squamous, stratified squamous, simple cuboidal, stratified cuboidal, simple columnar, stratified columnar, pseudostratified columnar, and transitional epithelium. Those are our major lining epithelial tissues. All of the surfaces of our body, whether internal or external, are covered in one of these lining epithelial tissues. The other type of epithelial tissue that we have is glandular epithelium. So a gland is sometimes unicellular, but typically one or more cells that come together and make some sort of aqueous fluid that we call a secretion. Sweat is a secretion. Saliva is a secretion. So salivary glands, sweat glands, things like that. We classify our glandular epithelia by where do they release their products. So endocrine glands, endo meaning inside, release their secretions into the body. Exocrine glands, exo meaning outside, release their secretions into the lumen of a hollow organ, so something like your GI tract, or out of the body altogether. Endocrine versus exocrine. The endocrine glands have no ducts whatsoever. They just release their hormones, which is what their secretions are called, directly into the blood. So here we're looking at a particular endocrine gland. You can see there's lots of little glandular cells, and their secretions, hormones, are going to just go right into the blood and then travel around the body. So all of our endocrine organs, things like our thymus and our thyroid and the adrenal glands and the pituitary gland, all of those organs of the endocrine system, they are endocrine glands. Exocrine glands release their secretions, again, into the lumen of a hollow organ or the surface of the body, like the sweat gland. But their secretions travel through a duct. Now that duct is likely to be lined by simple columnar, simple cuboidal, or say the stratified versions of those. So the pancreas is actually a really awesome example of glandular epithelia because it contains actually both exocrine cells and endocrine cells. So the endocrine cells of the pancreas are called the islet cells, and they produce two hormones that help us regulate our blood sugar into the blood, whereas the acinar portion of the pancreas produces digestive enzymes that travel through ducts to eventually go into the small intestine in order for us to digest our food. So the pancreas is kind of a cool example of an organ that has both exocrine cells in it as well as endocrine cells in it.